Ladies and gentlemen, this shortgaming.com video, we're going to have a daily tech news roundup. These, of course, are pieces of news which are not necessarily huge, but are certainly worthy of discussion, and of course we're just going to amalgamate them into one behemoth of a video. Well, maybe not behemoth, but it's still a video. We're going to start things out with AMD revealing the official lineup of processors which it believes can work with VR platforms. Then we're going to quickly delve into the R9 380 GPU, which is actually unlockable to an R9 380X thanks to a BIOS switch of all things. And then finally we're going to finish things off with Intel's Xeon D 1571 CPU, which is, as you could probably imagine, made for servers, but it's pretty damn power efficient. It's based on the Broadwell architecture, so we'll go into that in just a moment. First things first, AMD have listed 5 FX processors so far which support the Oculus Rift. Now, do remember that essentially the Oculus Rift doesn't really have any processing built in. Therefore, it really falls back down to primarily the GPU to be able to push the frames of animation to the system. Really, you need something along the lines of a GTX 970 or an R9 290, at least currently, as a minimum. And obviously some of this will also come down to the games you're running, of course. But really, the CPU isn't doing so much of the processing. Therefore, while certain games are certainly very CPU intensive, most games are, at least on the Oculus Rift, really down to the GPU. AMD are currently doing some checking internally of what it believes are possible to run, and the minimum entry so far that they've gotten working is an FX 6350, and then you've got an FX 8350, the FX 8370, the 9370, and then finally the 9590. Now, all of those apart from one are of 8 core CPUs, and then the FX 6350, of course, is a 6-core CPU. I'm not particularly surprised by any of this when one considers that the real bulk of the processing once again does go to the GPU. Now, interestingly, the Oculus Rift compatibility tool does not support these processors. It will tell you that you don't meet the minimum requirements, essentially. However, that's not really surprising. The actual tool doesn't really do any checking regarding the performance of your machine. Essentially, it's really just saying what parts do you have, and it's basically doing an if or statement. It's pretty much saying, do you have X, or rather your machine has X, is that part listed in amongst the parts that we know are going to be compatible? If no, then your system is not capable of running that piece of hardware. So it won't take into account, for example, overclocks. It won't take into account any of this stuff. So therefore, it's not exactly something you should listen to verbatim. So in this case, if AMD have done the checking, then of course, at least for now, we can defer to their judgment. Moving on, and this one's not a massive piece of news, but it's of a slight interest. Because while many gamers are certainly probably not going to get their hands on this thing because it's primarily aimed at the Chinese market, XFX have actually released an R9 380, which with just the press of a BIOS button will unlock to an R9 380X for around a 10-ish% performance boost, depending of course on the application. Now, that's not an amazing new feature, the fact you've got a BIOS toggle button. A lot of manufacturers do actually do this, and it's typically placed kind of near the card where, the edge of the card where it's easily accessible by a user, and it will do something along the lines of, in a traditional setting, increasing the clock speeds of the GPU. For example, it might give a 5% standard increase in clock speed. This, however, doesn't do that. What it does is actually increase the number of shaders and other components available to put out extra performance. It's kind of cool, and once again is kind of a novel feature. However, it probably won't be something that we ourselves are going to use because it's sold in China primarily for the price of around 230-ish US, which is probably not that great of a deal when one considers that that's about the price that you're going to pay, at least typically, for an reference R9 380X. When one considers, however, that this does come with a custom cooler, tri-fans and all of that jazz, it could well be that you might want to go for it anyway. But, of course, overclocking, as usual, is down to the silicon lottery. Personally, if it were me, I would give this one a miss, and I would rather go ahead and plonk down the extra money for an R9 380X proper, where obviously that's the guaranteed clock speeds and you're probably going to get a nicer overclock. However, your mileage may vary, and obviously there's not been a huge amount of testing done regarding the clock speeds. Do remember that Polaris itself is probably going to be released in about 3 or 4 months time anyway, and because this is aimed once again just at the Chinese market primarily, you're probably never going to see this on retail store shelves, but I wanted to talk about it because it's kind of cool if nothing else. Next thing, Intel. So Intel are of course a big player in the server market, and they do a myriad of different processors for different usages. Now, microservers are certainly something that Intel are focusing on quite a bit at the moment, and they have just released the newest chip in the Xeon D family, known as Xeon D 1571. What does it have? Well, it's got 16 cores, that's what it has, which, because of it's got hyper-threading, does mean that it can support up to 32 threads, which is absolutely damn impressive. Clock speed is not really the focus of this processor. In fact, it actually has a 35% fewer clock speed, or lower clock speed, because it has additional Broadwell cores, and the clock speed is just around 1.3 gigahertz, which is not that impressive when one considers the screaming 4 or 5 gigahertz that a lot of us are using nowadays for their desktop processors. However, the TDP is pretty minuscule. It's just 45 watts, which is damn impressive when one compares it to a lot of the competitors, and it has 24 megabytes of level 3 cache. What is this primarily aimed at? Well, according to Intel, it's aimed at things such as storage, it's aimed at web hosting, object caching, dedicated hosting, that type of jazz. In other words, it's going to be really good for those who will want to put together various servers and cloud hosting for their clients, and those, let's say, cell usage per processor core could be pretty good for that. Could also be good once again for object caching. It is not really going to be used for like hyper super duper heavy workloads per core, but this is one of those cases where web browsing, that type of stuff, doesn't really, or rather web hosting, doesn't really require ultra high end processors typically, especially in a cloud-based environment. And obviously in this case you're looking to pack in as many processors as possible and be fairly efficient in terms of power usage. There is also going to be another derivative of this processor, which is going to be basically the same thing. The only difference is it's going to have higher clock speeds, and that model is going to be known as the Xeon D 1587. It's not exactly a pretty name, but it's a name. So, are you going to be using this on your desktop? Probably not, but it's worth noting at the very least. All of the typical extensions and features of the Broadwell architecture is going to be, of course, present. So you've got virtualization, AVX2, TSX, and all of the other standard features that you would come to expect nowadays. Once again, this is a processor that has very specific usage, but in that type of usage it's going to remain very popular. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.